Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tinellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and enjoy. Back in 2015, when I began to think that perhaps I needed some professional guidance with my dream to become a novelist, I picked up a book called How to Write Your Blockbuster. Reading that book changed my life, a no-nonsense guide to how to go about writing commercial fiction filled with practical advice and tips to help a novice writer finish a draft in a year. What followed, I have to confess, was a slight obsession with the woman who wrote it, an Australian world-class international best-selling raconteur who at the time had written 28 fiction books. I sought her out online and learned that she runs masterclasses for people like me, people who are looking for practical support in this novel writing business. What I found was something I could only have dreamed of. 5 years on and another 6 books to her name, this author continues to enthrall and delight her fans with sweeping historical sagas that take her and her readers across the globe. Earlier this month, her brand new exquisite novel, The Champagne War, published by Penguin, hit the shelves across Australia. Humbly, I say, listeners, it is her best one yet. So it is with delight and pride that I welcome Fiona McIntosh to the podcast today. Hi, Fiona.
Hello, Claudine. What an introduction. I feel, are we talking about the same person here as me? But thank you. I'm thrilled that I've had that effect on you and that it will continue to inspire you and motivate. That's the whole plan.
Indeed, and it most certainly is. Fiona, I wanted to say congratulations on a most spectacular, heart-wrenching novel in the Champagne War. I absolutely loved it. Now, you've said that this novel took its pound of flesh from you. It was written at a difficult time in your life. So I wanted to ask, how are you feeling to finally see it out in the world?
Yeah, it's a powerful feeling because I pushed through very challenging times to get this book written. And for you and for a few others that have made the same remark that it is arguably my best work is about as good and fine a compliment as I could ever imagine getting for this book, because at the time we weren't sure there would even be a book. To put people out of their suspense, my father got ill and passed away as I started to write this book, and it was it was such a shock. None of us saw it coming, and he was like Peter Pan in our lives, in the family's life, and he was a real sparkly creature that moved through the family and around the family, and a real motivating influence to us all. And so when that light went out, it was not only unexpected and shocking, it was obliterating. And it required me to really search myself for what next, and come to the conclusion, as we all must when we're grieving, that we're only here for a short time, and that's all of us. So there's no point in, when somebody has finished their time here, destroying yourself over that. You just have to, look back with absolute delicious memory, as I do now, and continue to be inspired by that person. And so, but in the moment of grief, you're feeling so weighted down by the burden of loss that you can't really see. You haven't got the perspective that perhaps I do now, a year on or 18 months on. I think even my publisher thought, oh, we're not going to get a book, because they knew that I was very close to my father. I was his only daughter, one of only 2 children. And so they sensed immediately it was going to be a bit of an uphill struggle. But in fact, it was the book that was the main distraction and was the great helper. But that didn't make it easy to write. It made it really, really hard work, real struggle to get this story out. And so, in that very long way of answering your question, to now see it on the shelves and people saying such wonderful things about the story, I'm truly, genuinely pinching myself, because, a year ago, I couldn't imagine that we would even be at this stage of having a finished story. So it's an extraordinary thing. And I think sometimes our creative pursuits can be our salvation.
Yes, wise words indeed, Fiona. I was so enchanted by the story of how you came to write this novel. So I was wondering if you could share that moment or the seed of inspiration that developed into Sophie Delancré's story.
My publisher believes I have a sort of a magic tentacles that draws just the right person into my life at the right time. And, you know, I could sort of shake that off and wave it away and sort of say, oh, don't be silly. But the truth is, I mean, she can cite all 12 historical fictions and say, no, can we just walk back through all of these? Someone has come into your life that has been the linchpin to that story and given you just what you needed to be able to do this. And so I have got a bit of a track record of serendipitous meetings, and I put it down to my attitude that I never plot my story ever. I put myself in the way of a story and I allow it to find me. And that is very frightening for maybe a writer such as yourself, who is trying to juggle all the balls that go into putting a manuscript together. And the thought of something so random and so no guarantees and so mysterious that I shall put myself in the way of the story, I think you just want to spit at the screen, I'm sure. But really, this is all I do. So the way that this particular story came about is that I was researching the chocolate tin, and I was up in the east of Paris, stomping around some of the battlegrounds with a war historian, which is where the main character, Harry, we first meet him, and he's in this region of France. And whilst I was doing that research, it was quite intense stuff. And I decided to take a day trip out of Paris just to, sometimes you need to just reset, you know, and clear your mind. And it was just like blowing the cobwebs away. So I took a day trip to Epinay and Reims. Now in France, they say Reims, but I'll say Reims, which is the English way of saying it, which is the great cathedral city of France, and where all the kings have been crowned down the centuries, you know. So well, I say it was a glorious city, and it's now a wonderful city. But I learned when I got there that not only is it the big cousin to the more country cousin of Epinay, which is where the main Champagne region, it's famous for all the main brands being located. This city was just about flattened. I think it was 22 houses were left, or 22 structures were left after World War One. And that got me thinking. And then I went into the cathedral, and it just so happened, as I walked down that great nave, there was a photographic exhibition being held just for a couple of weeks. And it was to do with World War One. And I was astonished by this sort of pictorial history of the war and what it did to this city and the surrounding region. And I could feel it. I could feel this story coalescing around me. And I thought, my gosh, there's a story here. So, but yet it had no real kernel. And other than this idea was now just sitting in my mind. And then I came home and I was chatting to my publisher about what we might think about down the track, because I always work 2 to 3 years ahead. And I said, you know, I could do this, I could do that, I could do champagne, I could do that. And I carried on with this list of stuff. And she loves it when I do that, because she said, I can't believe you're letting me pick. And she said, oh, hands down, champagne, please. It's my favorite drink in the world. Please do champagne. And I thought, okay. So now I know where I have to go to get this story. And I've already know my era, because I couldn't resist that World War One photographic exhibition and everything I'd learned about how the civilians left behind coped with 4 years of war on their doorstep. So the front line for France was just outside Reims, and it was just terrifying. And I went to Epinay. Sorry, this is another long-winded answer, isn't it? Off I went to Epinay, and I was with my husband, and he always feels very nervous at this stage because there's no story, you see, and yet we're spending lots and lots of money just putting ourselves, as I say, in the way of a story. And he always says, is it happening yet? He gets very impatient. And I have to sort of settle him down and say, look, just be quiet and let me be and let me find this story. Anyway, we were walking down the main Avenue de Champagne in Epinay, which I'm sure many of your readers have also walked down. And for those who have, they'll know that it's full of ostentatious buildings and very famous brands. Or they're sort of cellar door, if you please, or they're show-off property. And I came across this very beautiful, understated, very country French manor. And it was a brand I didn't know. It was called House Gonnet. And I was admiring it. And I said to my husband, well, if I was allowed to choose to live in any one of these places, this is the place I'd choose, because it's so gorgeous. It's like a little fairy tale sitting here amongst all these dramatic buildings. Anyway, we were taking photographs, and I noticed there were some tradies getting ready to obviously do some work on this particular property. One of them peeled away and came towards us, and it was a woman, and she was covered in dust and paint and hair all tumbled up and jeans. And she said, can I help you? And we sort of said, oh, look, sorry, we don't mean to trespass. We're just admiring this house, and we're from Australia. And she said, oh, the French do like Australians. And she said, would you like to see inside? And I mean, she hadn't even finished the sentence, and I was already at the front door. You know, I'd legged it to the front door. And then I sort of gathered my senses and said, oh, look, you know, I'm very eager to get in through these doors, but how about the owners? How are they going to feel if we just all stomp in? And she said, no, I am the owner. And so she took us inside into this glorious house over 4 or 5 stories, and just sat us down, opened a bottle of champagne. It was like 10:30 in the morning, sat Ian in a corner with a bottle of champagne. You couldn't have got a better deal, really. And the two of us got chatting. And the more Sophie talked, the more I realized that I was meeting my character. Sophie Signol is her name, and she is the daughter of a champagne maker. She is the 6th generation of champagne makers, and she has inherited this fabulous boutique, you could call it, house from her father and her grandfather and before then. And she had a real skill in this area. She learned how to tend the vines and be a vigneron at his knee, and then she learned at his knee how to make champagne. And she's a widow, and she's raised children through tough times. And everything she said, everything, I began to fall in love with this girl. I was completely mesmerized by her. And then when she began to talk about making champagne, it was just her passion and the way she spoke about it. I just stopped her and said, Sophie, you are my character. And I said, I really, really want to rummage around in your life and then take you back 100 years and make you my character. And she said, if you give me the most torrid affair, I need a massive romance, you can do what you like with me. And so we made this bargain, you know, over a bottle of champagne, and it was hilarious. And she just is so tickled to be the main character. And she also gave me the name of Delancré, which is a family name that has sort of died out because there aren't any sons. But she said, it's our name, it's in our family, and it belongs to this region. And so I said, okay, we're going to call the character Sophie Delancré. And she said, and I'll tell you what, when you bring the book out, because she trusted me, she said, maybe we can make a champagne in the name of Delancré. And I was just like, oh my gosh, this was so meant to happen, wasn't it? And this is what I mean. It's just that courage, I suppose, and my complete faith and trust in myself that I will find the story if I just go and put myself in the right place at the right time. I know that characters and places and stories will find me. And so that is how it all came about. And from there on, it was just a breeze. I mean, it took 4 trips to Epinay to learn everything I needed to learn, because there are so many layers to this story, so much for me to learn and absorb before I could even think about writing it. And then on top of that, the death of my father just made it like, it felt like Everest. But I had Sophie. I knew I had Sophie all the way down the line. So
marvelous tale, absolutely brilliant. So for those who haven't had the pleasure of reading it like I have, can you tell us a little bit more about the story?
I don't want anyone to, and thank you for not actually saying this beautiful historical romance that you've written, Fiona, because I just start shying away the minute I'm described as a romance writer, because I am not. And that is no disrespect to the people who write romance. As you'll remember from our masterclass, I sort of gave a description of what a real romance, category romance, looks and feels like, and the tropes and the conventions that a romance reader comes to that kind of book and that genre for. And it's got a massive following around the world, but I don't sit in that genre. I would describe myself as historical adventure, and I cannot walk away from the fact that my stories are romantic. But they are set in romantic times against a romantic backdrop with a romantic landscape. And even the characters themselves are quite romantic in how I make them up. However, this story is actually, and you've read it, you will understand why I say this, it's quite harrowing in parts. There's tremendous darkness in the story, and I have to somehow balance that with giving a lot of light as well in the story. And so it's essentially this, there are three main characters, but there are two that we follow very closely. Our champagne maker, champenoise, Sophie Delancré, and a British chemist who is a pacifist but joins up for World War I after the first gassing, when the Germans first let rip with chlorine gas and the devastation it wreaks. And he is so horrified that it was made by a chemist and that he might be asked to join in with the big push in Britain to make an even more lethal poison gas. He joins up. He'd rather sit behind a rifle or jump over a trench top and get mowed down. Just sort of honest war, face to face. We're following Charlie's story through Flanders and into France, and we're following Sophie's story as a newlywed woman looking forward to life and all that the happiness that falling in love and thinking about family is bringing her. And then World War I strikes and just devastates her life. It takes away her husband, who goes almost immediately missing, and he's trapped in that terrible first gassing, presumed dead. And so Sophie faces 4 hard years of melancholy, misery, battle, death, and all the problems associated with war of the women left behind. And so it's a very sad and melancholy story. And these two people, her and Charlie, under circumstances would have met, except under the circumstances of the Champagne War. And how they meet is rather extraordinary, and they build this very strong relationship together that sort of helps one another through the darkest times. That's what the story is about. But there's great joy in the story when we get into Epernay and begin to learn about Champagne and those vineyards. And I give each grape a personality to bring romance into the story. Oh, look, it's just a big epic tale, isn't it? And sort of heart-wrenching all the way through.
Indeed it is. Now, your character Sophie is a strong woman who in many ways is ahead of her time and forging a career for herself in what was then a very male-dominated industry. This is a theme that you've explored time and again in your novels, and one of the many reasons, no doubt, why people are drawn to your stories. So I wanted to ask, is this conscious or more serendipitous, do you think?
No, it's utterly conscious. I really wanted to start writing historical fiction back in, I'd written all those fantasy stories, and there's about 14 big adult fantasy books with my name on them in all sorts of languages. And all of those fantasy books were really led by men, by male characters, and I loved them. They were all really Mr. Darcy, whether he was in chainmail or screaming in a dungeon. It was actually Colin Firth as Mr. Darcy walking around my pages. But I loved writing male characters. And although there were strong women, it was really a male-dominated genre that I was, the storytelling was coming from a male point of view. But I noticed that when I wrote female characters, I was writing very strong female characters. They were quite kick-ass. They weren't sort of shy, retiring types. And I realized, while I loved writing men, I was obviously really good at writing women from a woman's perspective. And so when I moved into historical fiction, I tried to juggle both, and I did Fields of Gold, and then The Lavender Keeper and The French Promise had these very strong males plus very strong women. And then I thought, oh, to hell with it. I'm going to just really lean slightly more, make the story's central character. If you had to pick one, it's going to be told more from a woman's perspective. And I've never let go of the men in my story, and I love them. So for Charlie in this story, I absolutely adore him. And I think all the men who are reading this story, and there are plenty, I've never had so many male readers reading my historical fiction as I have for this. And the men are loving both characters, but they love that there is this very strong bloke in it as well. So I'm perhaps now returning to that more balancing it up a little bit more, which I think is probably the most comfortable way to write it. But I can't let go of having a strong female central character, because I think I get very bored if women act weak. I get very bored with them, and I will kill them in my stories because I can, I'll just get rid of them somehow. I need all my females, if they're leading my stories, to solve their own dilemmas and to be on the front foot at all times. So yeah, it is a very conscious point of view that I take.
I was going to say that we obviously learn about some phenomenal avant-garde women in your books, Fiona, but equally you're able to conjure these most marvellous male characters in your historical books. And I think I've fallen in love with just about every one of them. Charlie Nash was indeed quite irresistible in the Champagne War, but so was Saxon Vickery from the Tea
So he
Garden.
was. Saxon Vickery is probably, he's sort of like that right out there, sort of big and golden and Robert Redford-y sort of... I do love Saxon, and I also loved Rafe from The Last Dance. I found him a very enigmatic character. Those are the kind of men that I write in my books. They are enigmatic. They are a bit distant. They're not easy to access. And I just like that sort of character who's a bit gruff, but has a tenderness about him, particularly with women. I do love that. I will never stop writing that character. As I say, I think it's the same character over and over for my men, because I fall in love with them too. And Charlie is very easy to fall in love with because he's so traumatized, isn't he, really, all the way through the book. He's quite a melancholy kind of character. I know everyone in the publishing house was saying, "Oh, Fiona, did it have to end like this?" And I'm trying not to spoil the story, but it's almost like a choice. There's a big choice that has to be made at the end of the book. And I hope everyone will agree that Sophie does, in fact, make the right choice. I don't want to spoil any more there.
That's right, absolutely. Now, Sophie Signol wasn't just the inspiration for your fictional character in the Champagne War, but she actively helped you with some difficulties you encountered while writing, didn't she?
Oh, she was marvelous. As I say, I was in Epinay all up 4 times, and she was there each time to sort of fill me in on all sorts of aspects, but particularly giving me an education into Champagne. And interestingly enough, and it was very poignant, that I lost my father at the beginning of the book, and towards the end of the book, she lost her father. And as I told you, she's the only girl. She's inherited this marvelous Champagne house, and she'd learnt everything at her daddy's knee, and she was incredibly close to him, as I was to my dad. And so we'd both gone through this pain and loss during this book, and so I could fully understand what she was going through, and it was sort of a glue that inspired us both to stay close and help one another out. But also, I mean, her ideas were fabulous. There's a situation in the story, and I don't think I'm spoiling anything when I say in real life during the war, there were all sorts of shortages going on. There were, glass shortages, cork shortages, all sorts of things that affected the champagne industry, but all sorts of industries. But if we just focus on the champagne industry, the real killer was there was a sugar shortage, and you need sugar to have the absolute alchemy that goes into balancing out champagne and getting it to do its effervescence and all of its marvelous wizardry in the bottle during the second fermentation. And in real life, there was a blockade. Sugar wasn't coming through from Africa, it wasn't coming through from South America, you just couldn't get it. And I could not get past that was happening in real life. I could have just not mentioned it and carried on with the book, but I would have been, cheating the reader. So I had to address this problem of no sugar. And so I mentioned it to Sophie, and she laughed and she said, "Well, we'll have to find another way around this." And it was actually a suggestion I made. I said, "What about this?" And when I said it, she just couldn't stop giggling. She said, "Oh, that's inspired." And she said, "Let's do it. Let's make it." And so she made up this champagne for me, using this wacky idea I'd had. I mean, to me it was wacky, but to her it wasn't wacky at all. It made perfect sense. And she said, well, you're thinking like a winemaker now. We tried it, and I've got the bottle sitting on my desk, and we managed to get a bottle home, and it works. It's got a bit of a mule kick to it because it's increased the alcohol level, but she thinks it's quite good fun. And she said it's inspired, and it is exactly how they would have had to adapt in the time when you didn't have this or that. You have to find a way around it. You don't just stop. She was great like that she responded to all my needs, and she allowed me to just run rampage. At one stage, she just turned over her whole house to me. She said, look, I know you need to, because I kept saying, I need to live and breathe this house. I need to understand its creaks. And so she just cleared out. She just cleared everybody out. And I lived there for 4 days, you know, being the lady of the manor, this very same house that I told you about at the beginning. And it was wonderful. You know, I just had this gorgeous house all to ourselves, and I could go into any room and I could feel its creaks and its sighs and understand it for the writing of the story.
It's just brilliant. Now, and there's a photo of this house in the front cover of your book, isn't there?
Yeah, I had to put it in because I just wanted people to know we spend quite a bit of time in this house, so they need to know what it looks like, and then I hope as they read the pages they'll begin to feel it around them.
Talking of alchemy, you're a bit of an alchemist yourself in many ways, and I'm not just talking about champagne making. For those who don't actively follow Fiona on social media, and I recommend that you do, your posts are always filled with luscious examples of your baking efforts. Your newsletters are a testament to life on your farm and the bountiful fruits of Mr. Mac's labour, which you promptly turn into some mouth-watering cake or treat. So I wanted to ask, do baking and writing share similar attractions for you? Is it a kind of therapy you use for fermenting ideas or just for relaxation?
It's interesting. I think baking for me is the flip side of writing for me. So writing for me is getting lost in my imagination. So it's a cerebral process. It's very selfish. You know, I'm absolutely focused in my own story and imagination and where it could go. What the baking does for me is it unleashes me, and it gives me a marvelous freedom to just switch off from all of that. And I am never, ever thinking about my stories when I'm baking, because baking requires a sort of, I don't know if it's a different part of the brain that has to switch on, but when I'm baking, you're focused on something that is about measuring and precision and preparation, but you've also, your mind is empty. It's the imagination is not engaged. I don't feel engaged when I'm baking. I'm lost when I'm baking. But it's a lovely freedom, and it's like my brain or mind just sighs into a comfy chair whilst something else is taking care of business. You know, I don't know where it is, but it's not my thoughts or imagination that are on the march at that stage. It's something else that is focused on a recipe and making sure that I'm getting every part of that recipe right. And I love it. And the great thing about baking is there is a reward at the end of this endeavor, in the way that when you do any sort of housekeeping, there is no reward. I don't know. I mean, some people might feel, oh, that's wonderful when they see a tidy house or a pile of ironing all done. They maybe congratulate themselves. I don't get that kick out of it. I just think it's the most thankless tasks being done. And in a minute we'll be upended by the dog that comes rushing through, or people. Whereas baking, you get days of pleasure of people telling you how amazing you are because you've given them this delicious treat. And I like that reward at the end of it. Not so much the thanks, but looking at it and thinking, that really worked and I got that right, or next time I'm going to do this. So baking for me is a real escape and real zen for my mind, if you like. So it's the flip of what I'm doing when I'm writing.
Oh, very interesting. I've heard you say that the travel restrictions forced upon us by COVID this year have clipped your wings, so to speak. So I wanted to ask, what does that mean for your future books, and has this impacted your release for next year?
It is a monster devastation for the books that I write. So every book that you know about that I've written, and I think last count it was 38 or 39, something like that, they need overseas, because I'm not the writer that writes domestic stories. I'm the writer that promises to armchair readers to a different landscape, to take them out of Australia and plonk them down in 1930s India or 1960s London or whatever. So that's my shtick. That's what is promised through my books. So it is devastating for me that I can't even leave the country. When this was first happening, I realized I couldn't even leave my own state, because I was already beginning to think around May, my gosh, I'm going to have to write an Australian story. And I'd never done one before. And then I realized, no, it's not going to be Australian. It's going to have to be South Australian, because I can't get out of our own state. Again, it is very easy to start whinging about that and feeling sorry for yourself, but the tough get going, and I am tough on myself. And I just thought, well, you know, everyone's in the same boat and you've got to produce a book, so get on with it. Now, the good luck that I had on my side is that I was in Europe in February, and I was working on researching a new book, which is called, loosely at the moment, The Spy's Wife. And it's an interwar years story. So it's set in the 1930s, giving everyone a break from war. And it's set in Britain and Germany. And we had traveled through London. I'd been up to Yorkshire and done some research. And then we went to, I don't know, Lithuania, because I wanted to meet my publisher there. So we're having a grand old time. But it was as we got into Lithuania, we began to realize this thing about COVID that was apparently from China was beginning to have some effect. You know, it was beginning to creep across the world. And we were beginning to think, we need to be a bit careful here. And then our next stop was Germany. And we scooted around. I was doing a recce. I wasn't doing really deep research. I was doing a recce, looking at the cities of Berlin, Munich and Nuremberg, and thinking, all right, that's my triangle that I'll work in. And this is the sort of feeling that I need to get. And then, you know, things were getting serious and we thought we need to get out. And so we got out of Germany, and I just managed to drag my huge bottom in through the doors before Australia closed its gates. It was that close. We just skidded in. Fortunately, I've got that. And so I can write next year's book, I think, 60,000 words into it now, and I'm okay. I've got enough material. So 2021 is safe. It's 2022 that is the real problem for me. And I had a marvelous story, absolutely, without doubt, the most exciting for me story that I was ever going to research. And there were a lot of people around the world offering help. And they were coming from Britain, they were coming from America, they were coming from all over. It was just going to be brilliant. But I needed to get to about 4 different countries. And it was a very ambitious project. And I know my publisher was just really excited about it. But there's no way I'm going to be able to do it. No way. Even if I left tomorrow, it's already too late, if you know what I mean. I need at least 2 full years to research. So it's not enough time. We're going to put that book forward to 2023, and I'll slot in a South Australian story that I've begun the research for. And I'm surprised. I thought I was going to really, my shoulders were going to be droopy as I was researching it, but I've actually got quite excited about it. And I know my publisher is deliriously happy. Now that I've sort of thrown a loose storyline together, they're just so thrilled with what is shaping. And so I'm pretty upbeat based on all their joy. And certainly the audience has said, oh, we can't wait for you to write an Australian story. And I've always steered clear, because I think I was born on the other side of the world, and I tend to feel that easier. I think when you're born in a place, all the Australians born here, they really feel Australia in their DNA, whereas I tend to feel, you know, Britain and Europe in my DNA. Yeah. So I've steered clear of being presumptuous enough to write an Australian story, but now I'm cornered, and like a caged animal, I have to respond. So that's what I'm doing, South Australian story.
Well, that sounds very exciting.
It is.
Now, talking about South Australia, I wanted to move on to a bit of a chat about Masterclass, if that's okay.
Sure.
I was fortunate enough to attend both a full course in April of 2017, plus the wonderful NatCon that was held in the Clare Valley last year. And as I said in my introduction, finding you and your masterclasses was a gift. I've been able to connect with a large community of writers who are chasing the same dream, many of whom have already found incredible success with major publishers here in Australia. So for those who don't know about Fiona McIntosh, the writing mentor, can you tell me more about it and how did it all come about?
Well, it goes back 20 years exactly, actually. I was, a bit like you described yourself. I had this desire I'd never thought of myself as a writer. I came to my writing at 39, so it was quite late. I'd always been a reader, but it never occurred to me to turn that skill into, or that joy of reading into writing. But at 39, it did. It was a bit like a midlife crisis that crept up on me and said, you know what you want to do is write a book, don't you? And I didn't know that, but I thought, okay, let's see where this is going to go. And so I cast around, as you did, for a solid writing course. And I just didn't like anything I was looking at until I stumbled across this one in Hobart with Bryce Courtney. And I think 80% of it was being able to meet Bryce Courtney, because The Power of One had meant so much to me as a youngster and had inspired me in my life, to go for it. So I wanted to meet him, and I thought, well, he's Australia's favorite storyteller. He's going to have tips and tricks and ideas, and he knows how to do this. So I signed up. I was very lucky to get the very last place, and I took off a week and I went down to Hobart, and it changed my life, just changed my life. Within those 5 days, I walked back into my home as a different person. I walked back in as a writer. I knew this is what I was going to do. And in fact, riding high on his utter confidence that I already was a writer, I just hadn't written the story. I wrote my first fantasy story, and I wrote it really fast. I wrote it in about 6 weeks, and sent it off to the biggest publisher of the genre and where all my favorite fantasy writers lived, which was with HarperCollins. I got a reply within about 10 days where they said, we absolutely love this, and we would like you to write 3 of these for us. Can you make this story a trilogy? And I was off. That was it. That was the fairy tale beginning, and I didn't look back. And I've been published ever since, and the books went international, and so I had to do a very public apprenticeship, because if I look back at that first book, I could cringe, but so many people love it. So I was obviously a born storyteller, but I hadn't learned the craft of really solid writing, and that had to be learned over some years. And Bryce had warned me off writing historical fiction. He said, no, it will demand its pound of flesh from you. Don't do it. Wait until you know how to write books. And I didn't really understand it at the time, but 10 years later, I absolutely understood what he was talking about. And that's when I decided I would start writing historical fiction. Anyway, it was in 2012, Bryce was very, very ill, gravely ill, in fact. And he contacted me and said, I'm going to need your help. I'm going to have one last masterclass, and I'd love it if you'd come in for a day and just spend an hour with these people and inspire them, because I'd love to point to you and say, Fiona's my great success story. She paid attention in class. She did what I asked her to do, and here she is, flying along. And so he said, darling, I'm dying, don't you? And I didn't know that. And it was really like such a punch in the guts. And so I couldn't say no. And so I flew to Canberra. And when I got there, I realized he wasn't joking. He looked so ill. And I remember saying to him, Bryce, how are you going to do this? It's 5 days and you look like you're going to fall over. I said, how are you going to run this class? And he said, I'm not going to, darling, you are. So he'd got me there rather cheekily on the pretext of, just spending an hour on the ground. But I spent much longer, and I was there out the front, strutting my funky stuff, as we say. And I by then I'd been writing for, 13 years, and I had something to say about it. He was very impressed with how I conducted myself, because he said, you're so ruthless, Fiona. He said, you're not at all nice, are you, when you're, because you know how I begin masterclass, and I am quite in your face, aren't I? And I sort of tear down all the dreamy stuff and put it in front of you all and say, this is what it is about. And then I build you all back up again. And so it is that process. And he just loved it. And at the end of it, he said, I'm passing the baton. And he just said to me, I need you to keep doing this after I've gone. And I said, oh, Bryce, no, I don't. I'm not a teacher. I'm not. He said, you need to do this. This is something you should be doing for the people behind you because you can make a difference. And so I gave him my word that I would do at least one, but one became two because it kept filling. The masterclass keeps filling so quickly. And so here we are in 2020, and all the masterclasses in 2021 are chock-a-block, and 2022 is already half full. So if I have thoughts of, not dreams, but thoughts of ever not doing it, I can't, because it fills ahead of me, you see. And this year alone, we've had 5 lovely dreamers, 5 newbies who just had the dream, and they've been picked up by major publishers in this country and all offered significant contracts, and they'll all be on debut next year in 2021 and 2022. And it's beyond exciting. I'm seeing their advanced proofs come through onto my desk, and I think, wow, there's Katie, or there's Tanya, or there's, it's just amazing that I remember sitting with them and sort of saying, now, how are we going to approach this? And so it's a real reward, and it inspires me, to be honest. Masterclass inspires me, so it works both ways. And we've now got about 400 in our community, and they're all great people. They're not there to tear each other down. They're there to build each other up, aren't they? From the gang, that they're very nourishing, and I love that. I wouldn't tolerate it any other way.
Well, I love it too, and I can certainly attest to the power of this program. So for anyone out there who might be interested in investing in their writing careers in this way, where can they find out more?
Well, they're very welcome to go to my website, which is very simply www.fionamcintosh.com. You can just click through into the masterclass and read about it, do some homework and find out if this feels like you, because there are 2 options. There's the main masterclass, the 5-day signature one, which is quite intense, and it has homework, and as you would recall, you sort of leave it after 5 days feeling quite your head full and quite punch drunk, delighted and excited, but quite exhausted from so much being learned and you're having to take on board. So I realize that there are other people who don't want to work quite so hard, and so I do the 3-day weekend mini masterclass, which is less intense and allows you to just sort of explore yourself as a storyteller and learn all the same. You cover the same academic landscape, but it's not nearly as punishing, and it's a little bit more informal and relaxed, and there's more time to talk to me one-on-one. So there are those 2 options, and they can see which one suits them, and then they can write to me and find out more. There's no need to sort of book in straight away. Have a chat to me and just see if this is the sort of thing that you think can help you. There's no pressure, but I will warn people, if they like what they read, they've got to book, because it fills really fast, and I do cut off the numbers quite ruthlessly, because if we've got too many people in the room, it's not conducive and it doesn't help anyone. So I cut off. Once I reach what I consider the max, I cut off, and I just have to push people through to the following year.
Okay, Fiona, what top 3 tips would you have for anyone wanting to start writing or who is looking for a home for their novel?
Well, I think for anyone who wants to start writing, they've got to stop talking about it and thinking about it and take some action, because to write is, as I say in my blockbuster book, that is a verb, and that means action. So you have to do something about it. It's no good plotting and planning and talking about it and joining writers' groups and just musing on it and, being part of a reading group and just thinking, oh, I'm researching, I'm developing. That's rubbish. You have to get on and do it, or the years are going to go by. So the first thing is be decisive and take action. The second thing, I think, is to truly commit. Many writers set out with a lot of gusto and just fall by the wayside because they run out of puff for so many reasons. But the main reason that they run out of puff is that they give themselves excuses to stop, because they're discovering that it's hard work. Any endeavor, anything, gardening, painting, taking up any new hobby, any sort of sport, anything, baking, it's an endeavor, and it means you have to be very committed to it. You have to really want to do this, and you have to be prepared to learn. Your first book, okay, I did it, but that's not the traditional journey. There are a few of us who get away and live the fairy tale, but for the most part, your first and second and third books are just you practicing your craft and learning. Your manuscripts are your great teachers. And so you have to understand that how you write now is not how you're going to be writing, in a year's time or even after masterclass. I'll change how you write because you'll be better equipped by the end of those 5 days to tackle a manuscript. So we keep learning. I keep learning. You've got to be prepared to say to yourself, I'm committing, but I know I'm going to keep learning. And the other thing is discipline. It all boils down to discipline, like any endeavor, as I say. If you don't stay at it and keep doing it, you're going to be one of those people that just talk about it or try it. Discipline is what gets me through, and it's the reason I am an annual producer of a book that sells at Christmas time, is because I'm very disciplined about it. It's not because I'm necessarily a better writer than you or the next person. It's just that I get on with it and I'm really committed and I don't give myself excuses. I'm never too tired. And I wrote my early books, my first 6 books. I was working full time and I was raising twins with my husband. There are no legitimate excuses. There are no legitimate excuses other than, I think having a baby sort of changes you a little bit. So that's not a good time to take up writing. Moving house is not a good time to take up writing. And when you're dead is not a good time to take up writing. So those are the 3 excuses you're allowed, but the rest of it, they're not legitimate. They're just you backing off. So everything else, your work commitments, your social commitments, your family commitments, the writing has to fit around that, and you still have to get to the writing in the same way that you have to get to cooking the evening meal or taking your children to school or going and visiting your parents. The writing has to fit around that. And yes, sacrifices will have to be made in order to do that writing, but it's got to be as important as you taking your exercise or breathing. So you weight it in much the same way. I mean, I would put family first over anything, but that doesn't mean to say that I would sit and watch television with my family when a manuscript is waiting. So yeah, you've just got to be utterly disciplined about it.
Fantastic advice. Now, I'm conscious that our time is nearing an end, but I think it would be remiss of me, Fiona, not to mention your crime novels. And for those of you who are not familiar with Fiona's work, in addition to the historical novels, Fiona has written a crime series, the Jack Hawksworth novels. And as a bit of a crime fiction junkie myself, I've devoured these books. And there's a new one coming, isn't there?
Yes, I am very excited because, like you, I am a crime junkie. And if I'm given a choice of any genre to read at any time for my leisure and pleasure, it's always crime. Always. Number one is where I default to, because a crime tends to, especially on long haul plane trips and things like that, it makes the time go very quickly, and it's exciting. So I do love the genre of crime, and I love writing crime, but they're hard to fit around the historical novels because the historical novels take so much time and effort from me that it's hard to take my eye off the ball. But there was this campaign started by a couple of people online in social media called Bring Back Jack, and they've been chanting it for a few years actually, and relentless with it. And it's very funny. Every now and then they'll post and say, "Bring back Jack. Why won't you bring back Jack?" And it's got its own hashtag and everything, and it's very funny. And I finally, in this COVID year, I had a lot more time, and I thought, I could probably get a crime written. And I'd already done the research because I'd been in London and I'd been thinking about Jack and thinking it's time to, deliver on these poor girls who are desperately trying to catch my attention. And so I thought, okay, let's bring back Jack. And the publisher was very happy. And so Mirror Man is book number 3 featuring DCI Jack Hawksworth, and it's finished and written, and I've only got 9 chapters of the edit to go, and it will be out for June, so for a nice winter read in 2021.
I'm so excited.
I am too.
Very much looking forward to that one.
Yeah. I love it. I love him. I love his you know, I love all his trials and tribulations, and I really love this story. It's a great story.
Excellent. Fiona, I could chat to you for hours, but for now, I want to congratulate you once again on a most wonderful achievement with the Champagne War, a thoroughly gripping and heart-wrenching story that will leave readers wanting more. Listeners, buy, download, or borrow it today. And Fiona, thank you so much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books.
My absolute pleasure. And to all your listeners, thank you for tuning in to this one. And I hope you'll go on listening to Claudine and encouraging her with her writing. And most of all, stay healthy, stay bright.
Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tenellis or on my webpage, claudinetennellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.